Look, it certainly doesn't mean that you can go to the petrol station and ask them to pay you to fill up your tank. But this is a problem that
That's
that
disappointing.
comes from it comes from two causes. One is the dispute between OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, and the Russians that began about a month ago over oil pricing and production. And secondly, some specific circumstances to do with where this oil is traded and stored in Oklahoma. So it's symptomatic of the larger problem with oil prices at the moment in the energy markets, but it's not broad across the markets. I mean, what you're seeing is there's less oil being used because people aren't driving around and they're at home and there aren't planes in the air. That's a bit of a problem in Australia as well. Trump has managed to negotiate with the Saudis and OPEC to get them to fix up their production so that it doesn't completely undercut the energy market. But still on the line here are a lot of jobs in this industry, and particularly in the US shale oil industry as well.
So we know with US shale it affects them because once the price is lower, there's basically no point in production. We know it'll hit Saudi Arabia and Russia. Does it affect the global economy beyond that, or is this more a symptom rather than a cause of what's going on at the moment?
Look, it's very significant in a normal economy, but we're not in a normal economy at the moment. So you'd be very concerned about this in a normal economy where people's livelihoods and, in some cases, their lives during winters hinge on the availability and price of oil. But right now, we're not in a normal circumstance, so it's hard to say.
We've seen Donald Trump give another briefing. People are sort of describing it as good Trump, bad Trump, depending on the day. He seems quite conciliatory today, but he has been having some pretty frank exchanges with governors. It's just fascinating to see, isn't it? We talk about our own differences on schooling when really all the premiers and the PM agree broadly. It's just sort of how and when to bring schools back. In the US, it's a very different matter, and it seems to be showing the sort of fractious nature of the US system.
Yeah, it puts our problems of coordination into context when you see masked individuals in full body armour carrying very high-powered military-grade assault weapons standing brazenly out the front of US Capitol houses in a couple of key states, urged on by the president telling them to liberate those states. The National Guard has been deployed in some parts of the US to maintain law and order. There is that part of the US political psyche that takes rights to a complete extreme. But the practical outcome of all of this is that we're still seeing inefficient allocation of resources across the US. Governors going it alone, the governor of Maryland reaching out to South Korea to bring in 500,000 masks and protective equipment. The president surprised by that and annoyed by that. That's not going to lead to the most efficient or most effective outcome for the United States.
Yeah, in part, at times, competing and undercutting each other or bidding for the resources within the country. I think it's important to stress as well, when you talk about the protests and the Second Amendment Donald Trump tweeted about, I mean, the whole point of this, of course, way back when, was to be able to overthrow a government. And that's the fear, right? In some of these states, gun ownership, so many guns owned, so many automatic weapons as well, that if anarchy really does break out across the country, the government can't bring the people to heel. Now, some people might say that's a good thing, but it'd have to be pretty worrying living in some of these places right now.
Look, I've been speaking to friends living in the United States who are very worried. Friends living, on Capitol Hill, not a place where you'd expect to be worried about some sort of gun battle on the streets, but now there are people openly carrying firearms around that neighbourhood. The US goes through this periodically. There are those incidents we've seen through recent US history of mass civil unrest, and part of it is that deep independent streak which believes that at the end of the day, government is a nice to have, not a must have, informed by their history, which is very different to Australia's, where I think we're much more accepting of the role of government and the existence of government.
And we're seeing, there's some fascinating pictures that have been taken in the past 24 hours. A medical worker in full scrubs actually blocking someone looking to drive through and continue to conduct a protest. The other one that we had was a truck driving past. This is the thing that they're talking about reopening. They're basically defying what governments are trying to do. We know it's hard enough, James, to get people to sort of obey things if they want to and properly socially distance. One of the trucks had "Jesus is my vaccine" on it. I mean, some of these people just don't believe in what the government's doing at all, despite what they've seen in New York, in their own country.
Look, it's a big country. You're seeing the political extremes on display. But I mean, we've seen in other countries too, large protests happening despite social isolation. We've seen in Israel some large political protests taking place despite the need to socially isolate. So it's not unique to the US, but the US does tend to take it to its full extreme. I think as long as people are comfortable that the government is making some progress, and that's primarily the state governments at this point, the polling numbers on the president's response to this crisis are not great. And as long as people believe that the states are making some progress, they'll accept those lockdown laws for the time being. But people will chafe. That idea of individual freedom and liberty is much stronger in the US than it is in Australia.